In this video, I'm going to cover why U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, once the mission changed from capturing bin Laden to nation building, was doomed from the start, and why we could have easily known this before getting involved if we just paid more attention to their culture and history. In 1972, when I was much younger and much more willing to take risks, I flew to Europe and bought this racing green Fiat 850 Spider convertible. It looks like a sports car, but was much cheaper and had an engine the size of a loaf of white bread. During the next 3.5 years, I drove, lived, and worked all over Europe, and then drove through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India en route to Sri Lanka. These are a few pictures that I took along the way. The trip was a life-changing adventure. The further east I traveled, the more difficult it was for me to understand what was happening around me. People didn't act as I was used to. Their behavior was baffling. Their customs were strange. They seemed to say one thing and do another completely different thing. This was my first exposure to really different cultures. I've been living and working in different cultures and studying them ever since, applying this knowledge in a more corporate environment by helping teams from different countries work together. These differences are also the key to understanding why the U.S. should never have invaded Afghanistan and why every year we stayed was a loss to the U.S. and the many Afghanis who died as a result. Understanding these differences is what I want to share with you now. To understand why these attempts at Afghan nation building and national army building were bound to fail, we need to understand the average Afghan male. Because if this guy isn't interested in a nation or democracy, he won't support it. He will support the alternative or what's most familiar. A democracy cannot emerge or continue unless a majority of the population want it, support it, and are willing to protect it. Let's call the average Afghan male Abdul. There are about 17 million Abdul equivalents in Afghanistan. If Abdul isn't interested in an Afghan nation or democracy, it's not going to happen. What is most important to know about Abdul is he is illiterate, he's incredibly poor, works as a shepherd, making just enough to feed himself and his family most of the time, and has a one-room mud-walled home with an enclosed courtyard so his wife can do her chores unseen. His sense of self-worth comes from his lineage and his honor. He has little in common with the 37% of educated Afghanis or the 26% of Afghanis who live in towns of 15,000 people or more. The central government is far away from Kabul and means nothing to him. His allegiance is only to his family, clan, and tribe. He has been brought up to obey his elders and clan and tribal leaders and to expect obedience from his children and his wife. He only trusts those with whom he has lineage relationships with and a few close friends, usually from childhood, and his trust is maintained with a continuous flow of favors and repayments. His only valuable possession, and this is really important, his only valuable possession is his honor, which he and his family and clan and tribe will defend with their lives. His biggest fear is that others will consider him, his family, clan, or tribe to be without honor, because to be without honor in Afghanistan is to be without allies in a very hostile land. This guy Abdul sure has a unique and different set of beliefs, feelings, values, and expectations than most North Americans and Northern Europeans. He also has a unique and different sense of obligations and duties. These unique differences define the Afghan culture, a culture that emerged at the dawn of civilization, a culture that enabled Abdul's ancestors to survive in the harsh climate, geography, and competitive environment of Central Asia. The question the U.S. should have asked before embarking on nation building and national army building was, to what extent would this ancient culture support or deter the development of democracy and nationalism? Let's examine the research that should have been understood by the U.S. before it embarked on its Afghan adventure. If you are Abdul, who do you trust to provide security and help when you need help? What must you do to feel and be considered honorable? And what shouldn't you do? How do you think dishonorable people should be treated? Who do you believe has the right to lead? And what do you believe is the best way to get things done and distribute limited resources? Abdul answers these questions very differently than we would expect them to be answered in the West. Let's see how Abdul believes and feels about all these things. For Abdul, security means security against natural disasters, conflicts, and disputes with others. When an earthquake occurs, who does Abdul look to for help digging out and rebuilding? When a dispute arises over what land can be grazed by whose sheep, who does Abdul look to defend his property? If another dishonors his wife or daughter, Who does Abdul rely on to defend and redeem his family's honor? Abdul has never felt part of an Afghan nation. Central government, regional government have never helped when disaster struck. Help has always come from his family, his village, and his clan. And he always feels obligated to help his family, his village, and members in their times of need. If a government representative, administrative or judicial, is from Abdul's family, village, clan, or tribe, Abdul will expect support for his dispute or conflict. However, if the representative is from another village, clan, or tribe, Abdul expects the result to be unfair. And in most cases, because of lineage alliances, the result will be unfair. Abdul expects and will likely get greater fairness from local councils, composed of village, clan, and local religious leaders. If Pashtunwali, the Pashtun code of behavior, is used by these councils to guide decisions. The code of behavior describes daily life in terms of obligations of honor, hospitality, revenge, and providing sanctuary. But even in this case, these councils, which are called jirgas and shuras, will only decide who has been wronged and what compensation be given or punishment imposed. The jirgas and shuras have no power to enforce their decisions. The wronged party must enforce the decision themselves, or with the help of their lineage. This mechanism pits family against family, clan against clan, etc. There is no rule of law, only self-help justice. With no expectation of support, fairness, or protection from the central government, Abdul has no reason to risk his life for this government. The research underscores this. 90% of Afghanis agreed with the statement, "My security is best provided by my family, clan, and tribe, not the central government." In the U.S., only 10% of Americans agreed with this statement. Consequently, it's not surprising that Afghanis have little allegiance to or willingness to risk their life for their government, while most U.S. citizens have a strong allegiance to and will volunteer to defend their nation and government. It should be noted, just prior to the U.S. withdrawal, the number of Afghanis who disagreed with this statement was starting to increase. Almost 15% would have disagreed with the statement, up from 10% some years earlier. These 15% came primarily from Kabul and were far more educated than Abdul. Perhaps if the U.S. had decided to stay in Afghanistan for another, say, 60 or 80 years, that is several generations, it might have succeeded in creating institutions that Abdul would trust to protect him and treat him fairly, and come to his aid when needed. Perhaps in 60 to 80 years, Abdul would become willing to risk his life for such a government and have pride in such a nation. Before attempting to form, train, and provision an Afghan self-defense force, the U.S. and its allies needed to understand the difference between tribalism and nationalism. Unfortunately, they didn't. To build a national army or self-defense force, your recruits must start off believing in the value and importance of the nation. It helps if their sense of identity is tied to the nation and they are proud to be part of the nation they will be defending. If they aren't, they won't risk death. Instead, when faced with a fight, they will retreat, flee, and melt away, perhaps taking their guns, but leaving their uniforms. Just what happened in Afghanistan. The Abduls of Afghanistan are proud of their tribe, not their nation. The tribe is the most important part of their life. It gives them a sense of worth and pride and places them within a group that will come to their aid when needed. Abdul associates none of these feelings with Afghanistan. Abdul does not think of himself as an Afghani, he thinks of himself as a Pashtun, or Turkoman, or Hazar. Why did the U.S. ever think he would fight, perhaps against his own clan or tribe, to protect a government that could not provide economic or physical security, and was likely to be biased against them vis-a-vis other tribes and clans? This is why when the U.S. started to withdraw, the well-trained and equipped Afghan army seemed to evaporate and disappear into the valleys and mountains they were supposed to defend. The research shows just how important tribal identity is versus national identity. 93% of Afghanis who were asked to agree or disagree with a statement, "I'm prouder to be a member of my tribe than a citizen of Afghanistan," agreed. A whopping 82% strongly agreed. To make things even more difficult for the U.S.'s goal to build a viable, sustainable, democratic Afghanistan, the U.S. had to contend with the centuries-old concept of balanced opposition. The concept of balanced opposition emerged thousands of years ago to prevent a stronger party from intimidating or bullying a weaker party. It also emerged because of a belief that the interests of distant power centers and local tribes differ and are often in conflict with each other. For this reason, the distant central government could not be relied on to protect the interests of the tribe, which required that the tribe be willing and able to protect itself. As a consequence, many tribes maintain standing militias, and all unmarried men can be summoned to protect the honor of the tribe. This is also often true for clans and villages. Failure to serve the tribe or clan when called brings dishonor to the individual and the individual's family. To prevent a stronger party from bullying or taking unfair advantage of a weaker party, everybody needed to be a member of a nested set of kin groups, ranging from very small to very large. Defense as a deterrent, consequently, is based upon an image of cohesive group solidarity. These groups are responsible for the defense of each member and responsible for harm any member does to outsiders. If there is a confrontation, families face families, lineage face lineage, clan face clan, tribe face tribe, confederacy face confederacy, sect face sect, and the Islamic community face the infidels. The associated underlying belief and support of self-help security and balanced opposition was that only kinship support, i.e. the family, clan, tribe, etc., could provide protection and security. Without the protection of one's group, survival was impossible. All this means is that the tribal structure of Afghanistan works to destabilize any attempt at creating a cohesive nation governed by a democratic central Afghan institution. Which brings us back to honor and shame, Afghan style. Recall when the Taliban told President Bush giving up bin Laden would be dishonorable, and the U.S. interpreted this as giving it the finger? The U.S. was not understanding the Afghan meaning of dishonor. In Afghanistan, honor, shame, respect, and retribution are intimately linked. Honor-shame is so strange to most of the 21st century world that it is often misunderstood. We need to break it down to understand it. Shame is learned, and it is learned at a very early age. It is important to appreciate that shame is learned because this means actions that cause one person to feel shame might not cause another person to feel shame. It depends on what the person has been taught. When someone feels shame, it is because their parents, family, neighbors, etc. have taught them through words and actions to feel ashamed, specifically to feel ashamed when they do or others do certain things. If an Afghani refuses to give hospitality and others are aware of this, the Afghani will feel ashamed. If an unmarried woman spends unchaperoned time alone with a man, she will feel ashamed, and if her family finds out, they will all feel ashamed. When an Afghani feels ashamed, they feel that others, Allah included, consider them to be unworthy. It's as if they have a terrible contagious disease. They should be avoided at all costs. We've already seen that Abdul's security depends on lineage support. If his family, clan, or tribe want nothing to do with him, imagine how emotionally horrible he feels. And worse, because of his upbringing, he also feels worthless and unclean. And he knows his family may also be avoided because they are shamed by association. Even worse, the shame may be passed to his children and their children. He doesn't expect nor would he trust the government to right the wrong perpetuated against himself. Consequences of failure to act are too dire. What the West would call vigilante justice is the only justice Abdul believes in. His honor can only be reclaimed. His shame can only be removed through personal action. If he has done wrong, he must right the wrong. More importantly, if someone else has wronged him or been disrespectful, and keep in mind that Afghanis feel disrespected by actions others might consider just fine, he must force an apology, force the person to right the wrong, or personally exact retribution. If he has been wronged by another tribe or clan, he will enlist his tribe or clan. Remember balanced opposition? To right the wrong. If he fails to act to regain his honor, this in itself will cause him to feel ashamed and cause others to feel he has no honor. This reinforces the belief in balanced opposition as the best approach for maintaining balance between peoples and tribes and for providing justice. This reinforces the belief that the central government is not worth dying for.
Note, if you're from North or South America or Europe, you probably don't feel ashamed when you have done something you know you shouldn't. What you feel is guilt. Guilt is also a learned emotion. Most Asian and Mideastern cultures use shame to self-regulate, that is, prevent people from doing bad things without requiring external intervention, while most Western cultures use guilt for the same purpose. With guilt, the focus is on one's behavior. I did a bad thing. If I'm caught, I'll be punished. Whereas with honor shame, the focus is on oneself. I'm a bad person, or others judge me to be a bad person. I can't live with my unworthy, dishonorable self. I must reclaim my honor and make myself worthy once again. Guilt, unlike honor shame, however, is not linked to one's honor. It does not require personal retribution. Just the opposite. It expects the rule of law to provide the remedy for the guilty action. This incredible difference in how Afghanis and Westerners self-regulate makes it even more difficult for non-Afghanis to understand the internal forces driving Afghanis to act the way they do. Since disrespect affects an Afghani's honor, and anything that affects his honor can lead to actions Westerners find bizarre and often unexpected, hence unanticipated, it is vital that anyone dealing with Afghanis understand what they consider to be disrespectful. Here are a few things. Failing to be hospitable, contradicting an elder or leader, not following the directions of an elder, leader, or anyone above him in the tribal or village hierarchy, bypassing a level in the hierarchy which would be considered an act of insubordination as well as disrespect, not supporting, often militarily, his family, clan, village, or tribe when called to do so, not repaying a debt or favor, or failing to respond to a request from a friend or a lineal relation. Being dishonest, but this is an incredibly tricky one, because in order not to be disrespectful in the ways that I just mentioned, an Afghani must often bend the truth. If a superior asks a military unit leader to have his unit lead an attack, the unit leader cannot decline, even if he knows his unit is not capable, because that would be interpreted as not supporting his tribe when called to do so. It might also be interpreted as contradicting a superior. The superior would not make the request unless he felt the unit was capable. Consequently, lies required to maintain respect are not considered dishonest. Afghanis understand this. In fact, Afghanis are good at interpreting the truth of statements designed to be respectful. Non-Afghanis, however, often accept the spoken word as truth, which can have devastating consequences. Consider this example. A U.S. captain asks an Afghan officer in front of the officer's men to lead his troops in an attack. Due to the need to show respect both to the U.S. captain and his troops, the Afghan officer cannot say he will not lead his troops and cannot explain that his troops are not ready or willing. Instead, he says, of course. But then he and his troops find some honor-saving excuse to miss the attack, putting all Allied troops in danger. When I drove through Afghanistan in 1976, what I saw made me think this is what the world was like when Christ was alive. Abdul's feelings about honor and shame are echoes of passages in the Bible. Most of the rest of the world has moved on, adapted to the Age of Enlightenment, the Industrial Age, and the Information Age. Afghanistan, not at all.
Two additional beliefs of Abdul concern who should lead and the mechanism best suited for allocating resources. Abdul believes that following the direction of a leader is required to maintain his honor and is essential for survival. Further, Abdul believes most people are born into leadership positions. Only in rare circumstances where someone acts exceptionally can people earn the right to lead. He further believes that leaders retain their leadership position for life. Abdul feels that democracy makes no sense and will only lead to endless talking and feuds and ultimately disaster. And as we have seen, he's not wrong. Tribal leaders do not trust one another. Each is looking out for his tribe's welfare, and each tribal leader believes that balanced opposition, rather than compromise with partners who can't be trusted because there is no kin relationship, is best for his tribe. Abdul also believes that building networks is essential for trading goods and services. Social relationships are needed to get things done, and these relationships are built and maintained by exchanging favors, often in the form of money, often in a form Westerners would call corruption. This is a system that developed thousands of years ago when strangers could not be trusted and a market economy did not exist. Nevertheless, it is the primary economic system of Afghanistan. Compared to a market economy, it is terribly inefficient, as the pockets of participants are constantly being lined with favors in the form of cash, services, and goods as part of any transaction. These favors create an unspoken balance sheet, where favors today must be repaid when requested in the future. Even when the balance sheet reads zero, the relationship that has been built contains the expectation that future favors, when requested, must be honored. Failure to repay favors or grant favors, once a relationship has been established, is considered dishonorable. And we have already described the feelings and actions that result when one acts dishonorably. This means that more time and more money was needed in Afghanistan to provide any type of assistance. And unless the U.S. operated outside of the market economy, that is, employed what would be considered corrupt strategies to engage the locals to support the assistance effort, nothing could be accomplished. So far, I have described Abdul, his values, beliefs, what motivates him, and how this predisposes him to reject the value of a strong central government and democracy. We still need to understand two other Afghan groups to understand why the U.S. stayed so long in Afghanistan and why staying was so wrong. These groups are represented by Asian, the average Afghan woman, who represents Abdul's mother or daughter or sister, and Masood, who represents Afghans' emerging literate urban middle class. The U.S. needed to understand ASEAN because there are about 17 million average women in Afghanistan, and the great majority of them live to serve their husbands and obey their fathers. They must even obey their adult sons. They are illiterate and understand that to expect more from life will likely bring dishonor to their family, their children, and their children's children. While they may aspire to more education, they also fear disobeying their husbands, fathers, brothers, and village leaders. Peace and honor are more important to them than any abstract idea of democracy or equality.
As for Masood, who represents Afghanistan's middle class, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, Afghanistan had no middle class. Nada. Zilch. After 20 years of U.S. investment, this had grown to between 10 and 15% of the Afghan population. A small percent, not enough to sustain democracy, but also not negligible. 10 to 15% equaled between 2.75 and 4 million people. Almost all of these middle-class Afghanis lived in Afghanistan cities and towns. Many of them were newly educated and empowered women. While still somewhat tribal, the constituents of this middle class were not fighters. The Abduls of Afghanistan were the fighters. But this middle class were the people the U.S. and its allies interacted with, giving the U.S. the false idea that the nation it was trying to build was actually coming into being. The U.S. also knew that when it withdrew, the gains made by this middle class, these 4 million Afghanis, would disappear, and worse, the emerging spirit would be crushed and the people would be punished, maybe even executed. This was a good part of what made the withdrawal so emotionally difficult for the U.S. and its allies, for they knew they were leaving 4 million unprotected people. 4 million people who had helped them during the war, supported them, and could have formed the backbone of an emerging democratic Afghanistan. If the U.S. wanted to transform Afghanistan from a feudal Islamic kingdom dominated by tribal warlords to a democratic republic, it should have been guided during the planning phase by the values and beliefs of a majority of the population. If it had, it would have understood that currently honor-shame influences and regulates Afghan actions. Security is achieved by maintaining one's honor, maintaining strong lineal ties, and balanced opposition. That national and regional government is not trusted or expected to provide security. Individuals and their lineage are responsible for security. Detailed rules exist describing actions that are respectful and actions that are disrespectful, and most people in the West can't understand these rules. Disrespectful actions must be retracted or they must be avenged. In the competition between tyranny, as in dictatorial rule, and anarchy, as in democracy, Afghanis believe survival depends on strong, lifetime leaders. Their preference will, at least at this time, be towards a strong dictatorial ruler. None of these current values and beliefs foster or result in the support or defense of the rule of law or a viable, sustainable, democratic government. Honor, shame, and balanced opposition need to be unlearned before a strong central government can emerge and have any meaning. Believing security, harmony, peace, and order require that some people have the right for life to tell the rest what to do needs to be unlearned before democracy will be supported. A market economy and the rule of law needs to be established before the corruption resulting from personal networks that are currently needed to get anything done need to be overcome. At best, support for the institutions needed to make a democratic government viable would take 3 to 4 generations of peace, gradual transformation driven by cautious educational reform, and slow and subsidized development of a market economy. I hope in this podcast I've shown why the U.S. could not achieve its Afghan goals. Abdul's values and beliefs simply precluded the establishment of a viable, sustainable democracy. The only way the U.S. could maybe have succeeded in making Afghanistan into a nation with a democratic government and a market economy was for the U.S. to create a safe, peaceful environment in Afghanistan long enough for democracy and a market economy to take root. Long enough in this case would be a minimum of 3 generations, or about 60 years. 60 years would be long enough for Abdul and his peers to die and be replaced with secularly educated men and women. In the Old Testament, Moses kept the Jews wandering about the Sinai for 40 years before allowing them to enter their promised land. About 3 generations at that time. Moses knew 3 generations were needed to change the tribe's mindset from one of slaves to one of free men. Moses wanted the Jews who entered their promised land to never have been slaves, but to have developed a sense of independence and cohesion not possible for those brought up in slavery. The U.S. would have needed the patience and fortitude of Moses to succeed. Some people believe the U.S.'s withdrawal was seen by China, and in particular Putin in Russia, as a sign of weakness. Actually, the opposite was true. The U.S.'s enemies, China, Iran, and Russia, hoped the U.S. would stay in Afghanistan forever. They understood that each year cost the U.S. hundreds of lives and thousands of injuries. Each year costs the U.S. billions in military resources, weakening the U.S.'s ability to respond to Russia's, Iran's, and China's expansionary and terrorist activities. And even more important, each year sapped the will of the American people to engage in foreign military actions. It is more likely that Putin invaded Ukraine when he did, not because he sensed U.S. weakness, but because he realized once out of the endless Afghan war, the U.S. would replenish its military and be better positioned to support Ukraine. If the U.S. had stuck with its initial achievable goals of extracting bin Laden and destroying terrorist training camps, the U.S. could have claimed victory. As soon as these goals morphed into nation building, without proper preparation and without the knowledge that in Afghanistan nation building meant at least 60 years of involvement, the U.S.'s action was doomed to fail. When a plan of action can't succeed, withdrawal at any time is better than staying. At a very minimum, however, if the U.S. embarks on an action with questionable chance of success, the U.S. should consider which supportive nationals they are putting at risk and how, when withdrawal finally occurs, these nationals will be protected. This is the one part of nation building that the U.S. actually has complete control over. And the person or persons responsible for this are the ones that start the action in the first place. President Biden inherited a mess. He knew withdrawal was the right thing to do. The U.S. military, believing they had actually created a national defense force, led Biden to believe he had months to evacuate the portion of the 4 million middle-class Afghans who wanted to be evacuated. However, as I hope I've described, the National Defense Force existed only in the imagination of non-Afghanis who didn't understand the values or beliefs of the 34 million Abduls and Azyans of Afghanistan. And Biden was hamstrung by Congress and really the American people, who never would have supported letting 4 million Afghani Muslims into the U.S. The best Biden could do was stop the slaughter, stop the dying and maiming of American soldiers, and put a halt to the constant drain placed on American military resources. This he did.